Good morning, everyone. I'm Gerard Hassan. I'm the MRC Content Manager, and I lead on the Perutz Science Writing Award. This is my second year leading the award, and the award is in its 24th year. It's our annual writing competition that the Medical Research Council does for all of our MRC PhD students. And this webinar is part of the training that we've been doing. This is the second year we've been doing these to help kind of guide you with what the guidelines are and how to write and submit a really good article, so you have the highest chance of winning. The winning article for the second year will be published in the Observer. There also will be cash prizes for the winner and for all those that are shortlisted. So this morning, I have with me two of our VIP judges, Andy Ridgway, who is a journalist and lecturer at UWE Bristol, and then also Dr. Roger Highfield, who is the director of the Science Museum, also an MRC Council member. Both of them will be giving you, some guidelines and tips on what to do to have write a really good article. And then at the end of that, we will have a short time for some Q&A. Due to the shorter runtime for this webinar, we won't have time to probably get to all your questions, but we will keep a record of what those questions were, which ones were answered, which ones weren't, to cover on in the second webinar that we're doing next week. So if we don't get to all your questions today, don't worry, we'll cover those next time when we have a longer time to kind of go over any kind of questions remaining. So with that, I'll hand it over to Andy and Roger.
Great, thank you, Gerard. Well, let me start off with perhaps the most basic question of all. Why should you enter this competition? Of course, we're really grateful that you're all interested, and there's a kind of serious point behind this, which is, you're benefiting from taxpayers' money. So, of course, wouldn't it be wonderful if you can explain to all those people who've contributed to your research how their money is being spent? And that's obviously, sort of an obligation that everyone should feel. But I'd like to think that it's actually really good fun to do, and it's really useful too. If you talk to some great writers like Bill Bryson, he'll tell you that clear writing means clear thinking, and it helps you hone your ideas. It's also a craft. I was absolutely hopeless when I first went into journalism, and it would take me like a week to write a 5-paragraph story, which is kind of pitiful. But over years of practice, you can get better. So I think it's good to hone your skills like this. And actually, communication is a really transferable skill that's really handy for dealing with colleagues, with the media, with funders, with vice chancellors, with heads of department. I think that a basic life skill is schmoozing, and clear communication with writing is part of your schmoozing skill set. So there we are. So please do all give it a shot. Now over to Andy, who's going to talk about developing stories.
I think that's great. I think if you take one thing away from this session, it's a basic life skill is schmoozing. So yeah, welcome along. So yeah, I'm Andy Ridgway from UWE Bristol, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it, just a sort of brief for what you're asked to write about. So you may have already seen this, but I can add a bit more sort of detail to that. So the basic brief is to explain, why does my research matter? And we want you to tell us in 1,100 words or fewer about the research that's within your PhD and why it matters. And as Roger's going to explain in a second, thinking about the audience, who's going to read it, as in potentially readers of the Observer, that's absolutely key here. But we're quite conscious of the fact that some of you may be quite early on in your PhD studies. And we'd like you to feel that you still have an opportunity to enter. So it's not necessary for you to have data, in fact, any data potentially, for you to be able to enter. It's great if you have, and then you can describe some of the elements of what you found and what that's showing you and what that means. But if you haven't, say you're at the early stages, or your research is being delayed by the pandemic, as probably in some instances you may have been through sort of lack of access to sort of labs and things. You can still talk about the kind of the importance of your research, what you're going to focus on and why. And often, you know, in the early stages of a PhD, you'll be tasked with doing a literature review, a literature search, just to know the existing research that's in the sphere that you're going to be looking at. So that can form a kind of a component part of you explaining why your research matters. You know, in other words, what do we know so far, and how am I going to add to that knowledge, and why is that so important to be able to do, and help to tell the story behind it. But crucially with that, don't feel that it is a lit review. Don't write it in that style. I think it's just important to focus on this as a piece for a non-scientific reader, and that you're writing for, you know, the hundreds of thousands of people who read the Observer, and that's quite an important element. So I think it's a good place for Roger to pick up now and tell you a little bit about thinking about your audience.
Yeah, for me, this is the absolutely #1 issue. It's not what you're going to talk about. Obviously, that's important, but the difficult bit is how can you say it in a way not just to interest your target audience, but to intrigue them so they want to read on. They've got plenty of better things to do with their time than to read your piece in the Observer. So how do you craft it to make them want to read on? And in fact, you know, I spent years pitching stories to news editors. And of course, you know, I found initially I would try and explain the significance of a story. And in fact, we've noticed in entries to previous competitions, some people write almost like Wikipedia entries, but it's not about explaining. It is this thing about intriguing. And I used to have a sort of joke: what was the shortest pitch I could make to the news editor to get him or her interested in the story and commission it? My shortest pitch in 22 years at the Daily Telegraph was 2 words. I said penguin prostitution, and the news editor said, "I'll have half a page on that, please." That was it. So, you know, that made people intrigued. It was a serious scientific paper about female penguins trading sex for rocks to build their nests or something. I can't remember. It's in the mists of time now. So you've got to think about it being intriguing. You've got to get that intro right so they care, and they care enough to want to read on to the end. How do you, you know, obviously you need a kind of surrogate audience. So the Nobel Prize winner down the corridor, they're not the right person. Probably your chums in the lab, they're not the right people either. If you've got a friend or a relative who doesn't really give a hoot about science and is not interested at all in what you're doing, tell them about what you want to write about, preferably when they've got their mobile phone in front of them. And if they start picking up the phone and checking their text messages, then it's not working, okay? But if they say, "Hey, that sounds really interesting, tell me more," then you're in business. You've got the start, you've got the hook to get them interested. So that hook to get the audience is, I think, the central issue of journalism, the central thing you've got to wrestle with. It's easy to get right if you experiment on a few people, preferably non-scientific people first. Over to Andy now, to the next bit, the easy bit, really. Structuring the story.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. Thanks, Roger. So yeah, I mean, I think it leads on quite nicely from that, in that grabbing your reader's attention from the very first sentence is really, really important. I mean, just to be really reductive about it, I mean, just think, you know, each year we get a lot of entries for this competition. Jorat will probably be able to tell you exactly how many we get. So the people who are kind of tasked with sifting through the entries have got a lot to read through. So it's important to sort of get their interest from the outset. But as Roger said, when you're thinking about writing in a more journalistic style, so thinking about writing for a publication such as The Audience, that's key. And bearing in mind that, you know, your reader is often distracted. They might be sat on the train or thinking about what they're having for breakfast. You need to kind of tune them in. You need to get their focus on the story and make them want to read what it is you've got to tell them about. So I often like to think there are good techniques from filmmaking that we can borrow when we're writing. And so as you're writing this and thinking about, well, how do I kind of put this together? How do I structure it in such a way that I am going to grab people's attention? Think about some of your favorite films and think about the way that they start and how the story develops and what keeps you interested. What are the things that the sort of directors have used to sort of keep you focused and interested and keep you watching to the end and keep you hooked? Now, a common approach, a common trope, is to have a really sort of attention-grabbing opening scene that really gets you kind of drawn into whatever it is. You might not know why the thing that you're watching is happening. You may not know at that point too much about the characters, but there's enough there. It's kind of high octane, high interest to really get your reader hooked and want to know more about what the scene that's been set at that opening moment. And that's an approach that's quite often used in pieces of writing like this. So you describe something in a bit of detail that is really important and really relevant to the broader picture, the bigger picture that you want to explain and why your research matters. But then again, think about how you keep your reader's attention. And it may be that straight away you don't necessarily answer all the questions, but you give them enough information to sort of tantalize them and make them want to know a little bit more. Because I always think when I'm reading a piece, it's quite important for readers to know fairly early on why they're reading about it. So to be able to kind of make sense. I mean, a common challenge, a common sort of error that crops up in writing is when you're reading something and a writer's gone into a great level of detail about something and you're then sort of 7-8 paragraphs in and you're thinking, actually, why am I being told about this? Why do I even need to know? So I think that needs to come in sort of fairly early, really, why your reader needs to know, but equally, maybe not giving them all the detail so that they keep engaged, keep interested and want to find out more. Is there sort of a final technique that I'd mention as well that is quite useful is kind of zooming in and zooming out, and I suppose you can kind of think about this from a filmatic setting. And what I'm thinking about here, particularly in terms of zooming in, is often the most powerful way to tell a story is from the perspective of individuals, because we as human beings relate to people on an individual level, and we kind of have that kind of social connection with people. It's where our empathy comes from, you know, in terms of those personal connections and relationships we have. So if you're trying to explain why your research matters, it may be that you kind of zoom in on an individual case of, perhaps it might be a person who's affected by a particular condition and what it means for them. What's the sort of day-to-day experience for them? And so how would your research help someone like them? But it can also help to zoom out and look at the bigger picture in terms of the number of people overall that are affected by it and the prognosis for them generally. You know, what does this condition mean for them in terms of their longevity and so on from a big picture? But I think that zooming in is also so important, because quite often we see those sort of big statistics of number of people affected in the UK or wherever, but that's in itself quite hard to relate to if you don't have that kind of personal connection with whatever it is that's being explained to you as well. So yeah, as I say, think about your favorite films, think about why they work for you. Because writing is quite a creative process. It's a really enjoyable process. There's no right and wrong, other than if you've not engaged your reader, then that's wrong. And if you've not explained the signs clearly, then that's wrong. But apart from that, there's a whole kind of spectrum, whole kind of lots and lots of different ways that you can get it right, and use your creativity to get it right as well. So I think that's where I thought I'd wrap up with that element. So there's a few sort of final tips from myself and Roger before we invite a few questions. But Roger, are there any sort of final things that you wanted to mention?
Just to pick up that last point, Andy, I mean, there's no one size fits all recipe for the angle or the hook to get you into the story. You've got eureka moments, disasters, personal battles, wondrous discoveries, baffling mysteries, power struggles, quirky findings, weird insights, you name it. But just remember, this angle has to mark the start of a path of a clear narrative that cuts through what you want to say, and often through a very kind of tangled reality. A first-person narrative has much more power. Make it active, not passive. Use quotes to humanize it. As Andy said, research is done by people, and we're interested in what people are doing. Color helps, a sense of place, urgency, personal struggles, and so on. Try and answer those questions that will pop into your reader's head. Don't use rhetorical questions like, why did I do X? I did X because. Just cut the rhetorical questions out. Although your flatmates will think you're a bit bonkers, pace around and read it out loud, because I find that helps get a sense of flow. And I think my final top tip is do graze the pages of the Observer online to give you a sense of how they're doing it. That instantly gives you an insight into the audience. So over to Andy again.
Great, thanks, Roger. So just a few final thoughts from me. So it kind of leads off from the last point I was making about narrative and filmmaking. In that, I think when you're writing, it's useful to think of painting pictures in your readers' minds of whatever it is that you're trying to explain. So if you do go with an dramatic opening scene, much like you might get in a James Bond movie or a Mission Impossible movie, can readers visualize it? Can they see what it is that you're trying to explain? Can they see into the waiting room where a patient's waiting for the results of a test that is so important for the rest of their lives? Can they see in an operating theatre? Can they see into the research lab where you are and you're doing your research? Can they visualize that? But what I would say is just be a little bit cautious there, in that you have to describe things in a way that people can visualize whatever it is, but equally don't overwrite, don't go into sort of florid terms that make it clear that, oh, look, someone's trying to use this sort of a thesaurus here to sort of to explain things in very sort of descriptive language. You can often tell when something's a bit overwritten. So writing's often about spectrums and thinking about where you are in it and getting a happy balance, really. And the happy medium that you want to be in is a place where readers are reading what you write and they're visualizing something, and they've lost sight of the fact that they're reading. I mean, if you think of a good writer and a good novelist, potentially, you forget that you're reading words, you're turning pages, you're in a room, you're there with the main protagonist and engaged in whatever's happening to them. So try and do that. Let's set this as a sort of challenge. Try and make us forget that we're reading and engaged in the research that you're doing and what it could lead to as well. Because then you'll be, we'd be hard pressed to not give you an award for it. So I think that's it from me. So perhaps we could leave it open up to some questions from everyone who's joined us.
So Jurat, you're going to moderate that, or should we just look at the questions that are coming in?
I'll moderate it. I've answered a few already that relates to things on the website, but I'll moderate some of the other questions so you can answer live. Again, if we don't get to all of these questions in time, we will capture it and make sure they're answered in the next session. And you can always email us as well to get the answers. Okay, so the first question, quite often we are asked to be able to answer the why is your research important question as an elevator pitch at 30 to 60 seconds. 1,100 words seems like a lot longer. Therefore, are we expected to pad it out with parallel storyline? Example, a parallel story to bring the science home.
That sounds quite difficult. Andy, you should take that one. No, okay.
I don't mind. I'm quite happy to.
You'd be surprised how little you can say for a general audience in 1,100 words. Actually, you can make a few points well, So I think, you know, if you add in quotes and color and context, you will get through that 1100 words quite quickly. You could put in a parallel storyline. That's quite a complex thing to do. You know, you could switch to give a patient's eye view and so on. But I think if you think of make some bullet points to a sort of skeleton structure for the story, and then start to flesh them out with quotes and color and context, I think you'll find you'll get through that 1100 words very quickly indeed. Andy, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that. And I think if you think about the kind of key components of a pitch, it's really a very much pared down version of what we're looking for. In that there's no kind of colour to it, there's no kind of storyline necessarily. It's, you know, what do we know so far? How am I going to kind of fill that gap in knowledge? And why that's important, maybe giving a few statistics along the way as to, you know, the prevalence of a condition that you're researching, or the kind of the prognosis of the patients involved, which is okay, which is an element. But as we've been sort of explaining earlier on, there are so many other aspects to what you might want to explain as well, that, as Roger says, I think you'll find that really you very quickly get up to that 1100 words sort of limit once you've kind of added that kind of extra depth of conveying why your research matters.
All right. So the next question, do you have any advice about how to navigate the fine line of overstating your research in order to create a narrative? I find that fear stops me from writing.
Well, I think I would, to tackle that fear, it's actually much easier. Well, you get a much better result if you overwrite first and then rein it in afterwards. If you're too tentative about writing things, you're going to start writing a kind of quasi-academic paper with everything heavily qualified and so on. So I think, you know, sort of for the first draft, first iteration, I would write it up as much as possible, and then maybe put it in a bottom drawer for a couple of days, look at it in terms of your peer group, and then work on the fringily over the top statements, and think about some clever qualifiers, like, you know, if this pays off, it could do X, Y, Z. Or you could add in a skeptical voice. You know, there is X from the Max Planck Institute who's very doubtful this approach will ever work, but we remain enthusiastic because of X, Y, and Z. So as I say, I think you should start off by turning the volume control up to 11 for your first draft, and then rein it in a bit, and you'll get the best result. If you go in thinking a Nobel Prize winner is going to read this, and I better make sure I use all the jargon and the classic awful strangulated prose you get in scientific papers, it's not going to be a great read in the Observer.
All right. Did you have anything to add, Andy, before I go to the next one?
No, I don't really have anything to sort of add on to that. I think Roger's explained it really well. So yeah, I think I'd agree with all of that. So maybe I'll take the next question.
All right, the next question. Many researchers don't have a personal connection with anyone with the disease they are studying. How do you then write about their experience without making broad assumptions on their own personal experience? This makes me think of the term inspiration porn, using the disabled experience as inspiration from a non-disabled experience.
Yeah, sure. I think, yeah, I mean, it varies. I mean, I think having read quite a few entries over the years, there are some entrants who do have that connection with a patient, and they do have that personal experience, and that's been used to really good effect. So if you do have that connection, you know, that's something to really strongly consider to use. But yeah, I mean, not everybody will have that personal connection, but you're still going to know about what this condition means for people who have this condition. You'll know about the symptoms, you know about the sort of effects on their life, and there's you you know, I'm sure this must be an important element of the justification of why you're doing your research, you know, and why it matters, you know, fundamentally, because you're there to relieve some form of suffering or give people a longer life, or maybe both. That's at the cornerstone of kind of the justification for kind of doing the research. So there may well still be some sort of element, but don't be too concerned if you don't have that kind of personal connection. There are other ways, you know, there are other sort of creative tools you can use to write a very engaging story. You know, again, if you think about research, it's often, you know, a mission with unanswered questions, with blocks, hold-ups, challenges, questions along the way. Again, you know, borrowing from film, that, you know, that there are sort of there may well be sort of elements of your personal connection with the research and what it means. So use whatever you have at your disposal, and don't be too concerned if you don't have that kind of day-to-day connection with patients.
Should I add, Andy, that of course you can just use good old-fashioned journalistic practice. I mean, if I was if I wrote a story about a disease or condition, I would always ring up. There's always a charity representing patients affected by a condition, and it could be that the press office there would be happy to hook you up to someone, you know, who is affected, so you can get that first-person account. You know, so that's the journalistic solution to it.
All right, Andy and Roy, thank you. I'm watchful of the time right now, so I think we don't have time to get to the other questions. There are a few more questions left, so apologies to those of you whose questions we haven't gotten to, but like I said, we'll capture this and make sure that they're answered in the next session. You can always email us as well. So let me just quickly share my screen to kind of give you a few important reminders before we wrap this up. So you should all be seeing this slide. Andy, Roger, do you see it?
Yep.
Okay, great. So just a few reminders before we wrap up here. Our next webinar, Ask the Experts, is next Wednesday, the 26th of May, from 11 to 12. Both of these webinars are being recorded, so we will share the recordings with you. So if you came in late or if you can't attend one, not a problem. Or if you just want a refresher of the things that were covered, even if you did attend, don't worry. As soon as the recordings are ready, we will share both of them with you so you have it available. If you haven't signed up for the next webinar and would like to join, most of you have, you signed up for both of them or the other one. But if you wanted to sign up but didn't get to, the form is now closed. So the best way to sign up is just to email us at sciencewritingprize@ukri.org. You can email us to, if you haven't registered, want to, and that way I'll get you registered for that and send you the link. Or if you have any general questions about the competition itself, please don't hesitate to get in touch, and I will make sure your question is answered as soon as possible. The deadline to submit an article is the 21st of June by 5 p.m. So just keep that in mind as you're working towards your submissions. You can visit the article website, mrc.ukri.org/MaxPerutz, which is the main web page for the competition. And on there, you'll find the competition guidelines for this year, winners from previous years, specific tips and things that we've given. So all that information is there if you need. And other than that, I just want to thank Andy and Roger for joining us today and for their helpful tips. The next webinar is very much structured in a way so it works from the questions students have submitted to us. So that's how Andy and Roger kind of structured that next webinar. We also have a special guest joining the next webinar. I won't reveal it just yet, but so please do join, and if you're able to. And other than that, thank you all for joining. Thank you again, Roger and Andy, and hope everyone has a good day.
Thank you, and do enter everyone, okay? It's going to be fun. We're looking forward to reading your entries.
Yeah, thanks ever so much for joining us, and yeah, join us at the next session, and there'll be lots more opportunities to answer questions there. So see you then.
Bye, everyone.